Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Say Again with me, Amrita Tripathi. I'm really excited to be bringing you these episodes and conversations, and I hope that you've been enjoying the season so far. You can always send us your feedback and let us know what you make of this podcast and all of our guests. Let's dive straight in. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Say Again podcast with me, Amrita Tripathi. So happy to be in conversation today with social entrepreneur Piyush Tewari, who's a founder and CEO of the SaveLIFE Foundation. Piyush, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Amrita, for having me on the show.
And, right before we dive in, I'm going to just reel out a list of awards and, accolades. And you had the Ashoka Fellowship, the Skoll Award, the Rolex Award for Enterprise. You were in Time Magazine's Next Generation Leaders list. GQ India Man of the Year, which should ask you about that as well. At one point, you were on Satyamev Jayate. You've been a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. And all of this, I think, just goes to show how critical your mission has been. So can I start by asking you what drives you? What do you make of the awards and accolades? And we'll track a little bit more of your career trajectory over the show.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again. You know what? I think what drives me on a day-to-day basis really are two things. One is that, Save Life is working to save lives on roads across India. And a lot of the conversations we have with people, especially the end beneficiaries, but also people who've been drastically affected by road crashes. There are both sets of people that actually motivate us to keep going and keep doing what we're doing. So I think that's a big part of the drive that exists for us today. The second thing that drives us really is the impact of our work. When we see Good Samaritans come forward and help the injured people, when we see, police personnel performing, CPR on an injured person, and a few years ago, you couldn't expect that to happen. When we see, some of the corridors, highway corridors that we work on become safer, I think all of these things come together to really motivate us and drive us. Of course, there are a lot of challenges also. But I think many of these things come together to make it worthwhile for us.
So I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the mission itself. And, diving straight into an article you just wrote in the print, where you said that every day around 460 lives are lost to road crashes in India, talking about how we can reduce the shockingly high road crash toll. And interesting, you say in that, you don't have to just look at the West for road safety related practices, that there's a Make in India solution to road safety. And you've talked about, in fact, effective strategies in place in 10 states. Can you expand on that a little bit and perhaps putting in context? This has actually been very, very instrumental. I mean, your work has been instrumental in this because before this Good Samaritan Law, which you and your team have been critical in helping get passed as well, there was not that much awareness. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. When we talk about a crash, we typically break it down into two parts. What caused the crash itself and what caused the injury suffered in the crash. And in both the areas, we look at the causal factors from a human behavior perspective, from a road infrastructure perspective, from a vehicular safety perspective, and from an environmental perspective. And that helps us get an understanding of what really is going on, what is really transpiring in many of these crashes. So, for example, not many people are aware, but nearly 40% of fatal crashes that happen on our highways happen because of vehicles going and ramming into parked vehicles or slow-moving vehicles, right? These are called rear-end collisions. There are many collisions that happen as a result of interacting with concrete objects that are on the side of the road. These could be bridge pillars, these could be parapet walls. In some cases, they can be road furniture, and they lead to a lot of crashes and injuries eventually. We also see in India, trauma care playing a significant role, or rather in actually not being able to play a role in saving lives because it's not efficient and competent at this point of time. So now the challenge has been that road safety is an issue that has been looked at largely from the guidance that comes from the West. So we have many aid organizations, we have many UN agencies that fundamentally say, okay, this is what worked in Europe, this is what worked in Sweden, what worked in Australia, New Zealand, this is what worked in US, and should therefore work in India or in other LMICs as well. The challenge is that of the 1.2 million people killed every year on the roads globally, 93% are in low and middle income countries. And you need to understand that the everything from how our roads are designed to how our drivers are trained to how we give out licenses to how our trauma care operates. Each of these things are very, very different from the developed world, and therefore you need practices that will work in 93% of the world as opposed to the remainder of 7% where, you have, certain things in order and you can build on them. So therefore, I think when we look at complex issues like road crashes, we have to apply a lens of cultural empathy and look at them from that perspective. And both with our work and the work of many other organizations in the country, there are now enough models available to show that it is indeed possible to reduce deaths in a complex setting like India by applying a lens of cultural empathy, by understanding what the local issues are, resolving them, and then scaling them up, right? So our zero fatality corridor model that started on the Mumbai-Pune Expressway and led to a 58% drop in fatalities over a 4-year period is entirely reliant on cultural empathy. We look at even road engineering from that perspective. What is really possible, what's not possible, because we understand that, there are land acquisition issues, there's litigation, there's all sorts of things going on. So you can't just create new paths or new pedestrian walkways, for example. So how do you use engineering design to solve this pedestrian issue, for instance, in a complex existing highway network that we have? So these are some of the things that we do. And I think the study that I was rushing to, the study we did with the World Bank group on documenting these practices so that it becomes easier to replicate them and scale them across the country.
That's really interesting. And I do want to ask you a little bit about, your take, like a quick take, if you have. How do you feel on this whole thing about like sort of self-driving cars, et cetera, et cetera? I know that a lot of people have said this may not fly in our region. What is your take with all the work that you've done?
I think self-driving cars will need a lot more work. From what I understand, and this is my understanding from a couple of years ago, so maybe things have changed. But my understanding is that maybe the technology currently can interpret, understand, and predict about 2 dozen odd road users that are there on the road. India has about 90 different types of road users.
Jeez.
So the tech has to, and each of them have their own behaviors, their own patterns, their own unpredictability. Yeah. So I think that technology will have to get a lot more complex. But once it does, there is potential in seeing, what can potentially, the impact it will have on road safety overall.
And this is one of those issues that actually impacts and affects everybody, all of us, right? The whole country. You're talking about all of the road users. I didn't know this, and I'm really sorry to hear about the motivation for you starting SaveLIFE Foundation. I did want to ask you what led to your interest in road safety. And until I was researching this, I didn't realize there was such a personal tragedy you and your family had to go through. Are you comfortable sharing a little bit about that and what led you to set this foundation up?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not just my personal trauma, but this is a trauma that, close to 2 million families have gone through in the last decade. So it's a very significant, public health issue, a very significant cause of trauma for many, many families in the country. But in our case, specifically, a young family member, a young cousin who was under our care at that time because his father, my uncle, had passed away when he was just 6 months old. He was struck by a vehicle on his way back from school and left to die on the road in full public view for nearly 45, 50 minutes. And, he eventually bled to death on the side of the road. And I think that's really what, struck me really, really hard. And at that time, I was working in finance. I was in private equity in the US for a US-based firm. And I just could not reconcile with the fact that this has happened and that, I spoke to him in the morning and by afternoon he was gone with that immediacy. And then when I saw what the crash had done to him, it just made me realize that this is a very violent form of death and something that leaves a lifelong impression on families and lifelong trauma on families. And I think that really became the motivation for me to start first looking at the issue, trying to understand what really was going on. And then when I learned about the issue in about 8 to 9 months after the incident, it is after that I decided to set up the SaveLIFE Foundation to do something about the issue institutionally. Because, I realized soon enough that this was not couldn't have been an individual's fight. This had to be done at an institutional level because, in the previous decade since his death, from his death, it was 1 million people killed. India in 2007, when this incident happened, had surpassed China to become world number one in road crash fatalities. And I realized that in his case, what we saw, which is public inaction, was not apathy, but a very profound fear of harassment, intimidation, getting entangled in the process of the law. And people had to be given that freedom to be able to help, to be human.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the first set of feelings that I set up the SaveLIFE Foundation.
And I'm so sorry for the loss that your family went through. And as you said, millions of people, in India, certainly, and globally. But I do want to ask you about that, because I think since I can remember, probably since college onwards, which is now many, many decades ago, but there was always that fear. If you were witness to an accident or you thought, listen, I should take this person to the hospital, somebody or the other would tell you, don't do it. You're going to get in trouble. The police are going to, file a case against you. And then this whole, and I think you're right, because, just as you talk about cultural empathy, the apathy was actually fear-based, entirely based on those consequences. So can you talk us through a little bit about the importance of setting up that Good Samaritan law? How did you rally support? How did you advocate for it? Because the other interesting thing you said is that you realize this has to be an institutional approach, not just an individual, just for more impact.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think the first challenge was to understand what the problem statement looked like, and discovering that the apathy, as in many cases, media would say that, oh, look at how many people are passing by this person, right? But really, nobody went a few layers deeper into it. So it's when you started going a few layers deeper into it, you would realize that it was really a very profound fear. Many of the people who spend a lot of time on the road do that to earn a living. Many of them are witnesses to these incidents. And what I realized was that they not only feared for their personal time and convenience, it was really a livelihood issue. Pull somebody away for a whole day and they may not be able to feed their family in the evening. So one was the understanding the problem statement. The second challenge was to see what the solution was. And that was relatively easy, because a lot of my friends from the medical community told me that there are Good Samaritan laws across the world that would protect people who come forward to save the injured from any kind of legal hassles, getting sued, but also criminal action and so on and so forth. And so it became a very clear ask for me that India needed a Good Samaritan law. But how do you, as a small, tiny, non-existing organization or a startup, so to say, really take on the mission of reforming, criminal justice system in the country, or how it operates when it comes to Good Samaritans? And I think that is the process and the time it took for me, about 4 years' time, to build a base, to identify other families who'd been affected, to rally parliamentarians, to have people like Mr. Amir Khan to talk about the issue of Good Samaritan law on Satyamev Jayate, to get friends in the media to talk about this issue, not as merely as an apathy issue, but also as a very significant issue of public health and rights. And I think all of those things came together when we moved the Honorable Supreme Court of India in 2012, asking them to intervene, saying that there is a gap in the law and that they need to fill that gap, because that gap was leading to unnecessary fatalities on the road. And that case went on for about 4 more years, so 2012 to 2016. But, 6 days from now is the 9th anniversary of the Good Samaritan law, because on 30th of March 2016, the Honorable Supreme Court ordered the institution of a nationwide binding Good Samaritan law that protects all of us from any kind of legal procedural hassles at the police end, hospital end, and the court end, while we're trying to help an injured person on the road. So it did take some time to rally people, but I think the good thing about our country is that there are enough people who want to do something. Yeah. And if you provide them a platform or an avenue, they want to align, they want to get involved, and they want to extend their voice.
I'm going to ask a little bit more about that in a minute, but 9th anniversary, that's incredible. And at one point, you also were or you may still be a member of the National Road Safety Council. That's the government of India's national body. You've been very clear that it's important to work with the government because that impact is coming through that partnership. Can you take us through a little bit of what do you see as the biggest impact you and your organization have had? Is it the Good Samaritan law? Is it this increase in awareness publicly? Is it in life saved or a combination of all of these?
Well, I think the The biggest contribution, all of these things that you've said are definite contributions. We've had very clear lives saved on many highways and corridors. We've of course had legal reforms. We've mainstreamed this conversation to some extent. But I think the biggest contribution that we've made, in my view, is for the public as well as the leaders to really understand the problem effectively. Because if you recall, until a few years ago, every crash was almost always attributed to a particular driver who was involved in that incident. It almost never spoke about the road infrastructure that was involved or the vehicle that was involved. And therefore, we could not see any solutions emerging, because what you're fundamentally saying is that 1.2 billion people are at fault, and let's try and change everybody in this country to become better drivers. Whereas, yes, that is true, but at the same time, you're not giving them proper infrastructure to drive on. The road is not speaking to you effectively via signages. Vehicles are unsafe. So over the last few years, I think the understanding of the problem has evolved. There are people who now appreciate that if you don't fix infrastructure, you can't expect people to drive safely on faulty roads. If you don't create safer vehicles, you can't protect people from other people's mistakes. And therefore, you will still see fatalities. So that has now led to things like the concessionaire agreement that is signed between the government and the road builders being amended, various aspects around road engineering being incorporated in the law. The Bureau of Indian Standards now drafting India's first road safety code, the Bharat New Car Assessment Program coming through that crash tests a lot of vehicles, the bus body code changing, where a lot of poor people travel on highways and then those buses get involved in crashes to make those buses safer. So a lot of the work that has been happening in the background is really what we feel is our biggest success, because we don't exist to become the longest serving or the largest nonprofit organization. We exist to not be required someday. And I think if you're able to create institutional change, get the system to change and reform, I think the faster that happens, the sooner we will cease to exist. I think that will be a big mark of success for us, is when we become redundant or we are not required to exist as an organization.
That's incredible. And to hear that articulated so well. So those of you who listen to say again, know that we talk to our guests about their domain expertise and then try to go a little bit behind the scenes. So how did Piyush Tiwari come to this stage where he's able to measure impact in such an incredible and life-affirming way? I'm going to actually now switch to the second half where we talk about you as an individual, your journey. You were born in Kanpur, and I'm going to ask a little bit about what's in the water there, because your younger brother is also a social entrepreneur and a founder himself. And we actually have a surprise message for you from him, which we'll come to in a couple of minutes. So you were born in Kanpur. You studied, I think it was IT in DU, and at some point did a master's in public administration from Harvard. But as you said, you were working in private equity. So it's a huge jump from private equity, which is probably like one of the, there was a peak moment for private equity, I think, around the time that you were there, moving to this social impact space, setting up a not-for-profit. Can you take us through a little bit about the behind the scenes, how this all happened?
Yeah, sure. So I was, as you rightly said, I was born in Kanpur. My parents are from Kanpur and Lucknow. So my grandmother was in Kanpur, which is where I was born. And then I spent the first 10 years in Agra, close to an Air Force base, which is where my grandfather served. He was a parachute scientist and he designed parachutes for the DRDO. And for the longest time, I had the dream to be able to fly.
Wow.
To join the forces, to be able to be a pilot and so on and so forth. And I think till about my +2, that was the only goal I had in life, which was to be able to fly. Those hopes came crashing down once I was rejected at the Services Selection Board for having an eye correction issue. And that's for the first time actually I realized that I needed glasses. It was a very minor error. So I came back to Delhi from after the Services Selection Board interview in Bangalore, very dejected, very sad, not knowing what to do. And like most, good Indian families who had some background in science, I was pushed into looking at IT and engineering as a potential option post that. And I took it on because I really didn't have a goal as to what to do with my life back then. During college, I had a great time because I ended up joining a student organization called ISEC, got really, really well exposed to international thought process. We ran exchange programs for students around the world, across 100+ countries. And I think that really started giving me a sense of, okay, I started regaining my confidence overall. But I also at that same time realized that I was not meant for computer engineering and that I was horrible at it. And so as soon as I graduated, I decided not to pursue that and to do something else, to do something more meaningful with my life. And I think at that point, I applied for internships at many, many places, got rejected at most places because these are all non-IT internships. Eventually, I got selected by a project of the Prime Minister of India called the India Brand Equity Fund, which was a fund set up by the Prime Minister of India to promote India as a globally competitive investment destination. And I joined them, worked for about 4 years there, which was the most incredible experience of my life. Traveled both with and without the Prime Minister to various places around the world in my early 20s, gaining very, very valuable exposure to how things operate, how government works, how international relations work. But also, travel gives you a great exposure in general, right? So I think I was very privileged and lucky to get that exposure early on. And then I moved to private equity, you know, because I got the opportunity to be able to build some things. And there the opportunity was to invest and build multiple companies, see how that operates. I was still about 26, 27 years old, not very experienced. But I was lucky again to have people who trusted me, who saw potential in me and gave me some very interesting opportunities. Eventually, I became the director of the fund in India in 2008, which is, 2007, which is when Shivam passed away. And I think that really transformed my life in many ways. I tried to, do Save Life and my corporate job in parallel, but very soon realized that that's not how, things work. And eventually quit my corporate job to focus full time on Save Life. And now I've been on Save Life. I think this year I'll complete maybe 15 years of being full time on Save Life, as its first employee. Yeah. So that's been the journey broadly.
So I do want to ask, especially if we have younger listeners or viewers, because there's so much pressure, especially that sort of crucible, that age of like university, and everyone feels like that first job and decision is going to impact the rest of your life. And again, I'm really sorry for the tragedy that led to Save Life. I mean, I think that a lot of people are going to be very moved at what you've been able to use that as momentum for, but nothing takes away the loss of a young life. So I don't know if this question will make sense to you, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts of like if you go back to where you were when you're 2021, feeling a little dejected, not sure what to do. Do you have any advice for younger folks? And I know you mentor young people all the time. You work with Gen Z as well. And I think Gen Alpha's, coming up pretty quickly. Do you have any advice, maybe not just for the kids, but for the parents and the families to say, look, it's not always a through line, right? Like it's not always like a straight line between point A and point B. And as someone who's hugely successful in what he's chosen to do, and also you were an India MD of a private equity firm before that. So you built your career and then completely switched streams. Any advice, any insight you'd like to share?
I think I was extremely privileged to have a family that was entirely supportive. I come from a very humble background. We've seen some extremely, extremely tough times from age 12 right through to age 20. Five of us lived in a one-bedroom house in a very, very challenging neighborhood in UP, and it was not easy at all. But I think the support I had from my parents really made a big difference. I think one thing that I learned from them is that failure is an opportunity to learn, and every time you fail, it gives you it itself gives you a path to rise or to get back up. I saw my father rebuild his life after his business crashed, pushing us all into a very severe economic crisis. He rebuilt it. I saw many of my role models, both within the family and outside, had very similar circumstances. So I think one is it's very important to understand that failure is an opportunity to learn. And I got that from my parents constantly. And I think I'm very grateful for that one big thing. The second thing was that my risk appetite had increased quite significantly because we had seen very tough times, right? So you knew what the bottom looked like. So if you got there, you know how to come back out of it because you had done that before. So I think that was the second piece that really became important, is that I was willing to take risks. I was willing to not pursue IT, even though that was a sure shot job, and do something else. I was convinced that if I left my job, which was for the first time in my life, and my family's, decades of challenges, that, I was making some serious money. And to leave that to do something else which did not involve money was a challenge that, again, was a big risk that I took with my life. And I think building, yeah, again, I think the risk appetite would largely come from my parents because my brother did something very similar, as you mentioned, right? So I think that that definitely comes from encouragement. And I think that is something that my parents did a lot. And I'm very grateful for that. In terms of advice, I think, I'm always wary of giving advice. My only thing is that it's important to surround yourself with a tribe that supports you, whether it's friends or family, and knowing that you're not alone. I think one big learning I've had is every time I've taken a risk is that I've found support constantly. When I decided not to pursue IT and do this job in India Brand Equity Fund, I found tremendous support in the organization to help me grow. When I quit my job and moved to Save Life, my misconceptions or perceptions about how the police operates or how the bureaucracy operates were completely broken. There are ample number of good people who will support you. So for every donor who said no to me, I found 3 who said yes. For every bureaucrat who showed the door to me, I found 5 who embraced me. So I think there's definitely an opportunity to build a support base and find the right people if you're really willing to put yourself out there and do what you're really passionate about.
And it sounds like not be afraid to fail. You have to be okay with
Absolutely.
this loss. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more about what you make of success and failure. But let me tell you what Anshul Tiwari, founder of Youth Ki Awaaz, who is Piyush's brother, has said. We're going to put this up for people to see. I asked him for any comments about you, and I gave him very little time, I have to say. And I said, it could be something that inspires him about you. And he says what inspires him the most about you is the way you carry the weight of purpose with such quiet strength. And I quote, he doesn't just talk about change, he builds it brick by brick, often when no one is watching. His compassion isn't loud, but it's relentless. Whether it's saving lives through his work or standing by family when it matters most, he leads with resilience and an unwavering belief that the world can be better and that we each have a role to play in making it so. I'm proud to be his brother, but even more than that, I'm constantly learning from him every single day. I mean, that is an incredible, to get that from a sibling, let alone another incredible founder.
I'll catch him and make him say that to me face to face.
We're going to put it.
Then we'll see.
Yeah, the next step is a video face to face and sort of. But that's such a beautiful message because I feel like it's also, especially when you get to a certain life stage, you realize it's not just about. I mean, it's such an incredible thing to do to be able to impact so many lives. But it's also about, for example, with the work we've been doing in mental health, we've been saying it's not just about talking or raising awareness in panels and in external forums. It's what you do, behind closed doors with your families, your peers, your friends. That's also critical. So the fact that you've been able to inspire and lead by example, I think that just speaks volumes. I don't know if you'll have a message for him, but we definitely should get to that at some point and also figure out what your parents are feeding you guys. I think it's clearly there's something in that ecosystem. But I do want to ask, so how do you look at, and for example, when you're looking at your brother's journey as well, he's had an incredible journey and he does, tap you for advice as well. How do you look at success and failure for both of you? And then just more broadly, you spoke a little bit about this risk, sort of the risk appetite, but how do you look at success and failure and how it might change people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Anshul has built, I have to say, has been entirely, independent of me. I have played some role from time to time whenever he needed the advice or wherever I could pull in my experience and knowledge. But, I started Save Life when I was 27, 28 years old. He started Youth Ki Awaaz when he was 17 years old. So I think that's something that really, he's pretty incredible and, in many ways to, do what he did. But I think the way we define success and failure for us is, I think, it's something interesting that I read, that there is this whole idea of, unicorns reaching $1 billion valuation, right? And then there are these social impact unicorns that, talk about impacting or influencing 1 billion people. And I think the way we've been brought up and the way we look at ourselves as being successful is about how many lives are we able to touch, through our work or through our efforts. And this is not to say that, you can't do that in a corporate setting or you can't do that in a media setting. I think all of these are legitimate ways of touching lives, of reaching people. I think just for us, because of our circumstances, we found purpose in certain things that turned out to be, things that were, more social impact in nature. But I think fundamentally the goal is to be able to positively influence as many lives as we possibly can in our lifetime. And I think that's really what the legacy should be about. Not so much about resources, because resources come and go, as we've seen in the family, and as I see every day running a nonprofit, right? The resources is something that come and go, but I think really what gives you power is how many people support you, how many people are behind you, and I think that's really a big point of success for me, at least. I think it is for him as well. But definitely, I think how many lives you touch is an important, parameter.
That's very moving. I actually think I met you first briefly at one of Youth Care Awaaz, like 5-year celebrations or something, which is when I realized, like, both of you are involved in very different ways in, social impact. I do want to ask you, and I literally tweeted this a few hours ago, it's hard to not get cynical and depressed when you see all of the negativity around us, like all of the uncertainty. I think, the news just goes from bad to worse every day, whether you're looking at crime, any parameter. I've also met people who sometimes will be like, it's great that, you found a cause or purpose and mission, and it gives you so much joy and meaning in your life. But many people feel that the causes they care about or the issues they care about are just too vast to make a difference. And I'd love to hear your take, because I do think that each one of us can pick one thing and then really work towards it. But what is your take about this thing of like how much impact can one person really have?
I think I'll give a partially technical answer to this. And the technical answer is that, when I found this problem that had directly come home, it was not that, okay, we are going to stop road crashes from happening, right? So if you're talking about climate change and you're saying, okay, there is a significant amount of carbon emission happening, you can have a goal that says that, okay, I will eliminate all of carbon emission, right? Or I will save all the lives on the road. But it's very important to start going granular to understand what is really causing this, right? Today, I can tell you that on Indian highways, gaps in the central median cause 25% of fatal crashes, right? So I know that today, if every gap in the median is treated to make it safer, you can save a very large number of lives just through that intervention, right? If you fit crash avoidance systems in trucks, you can save 30-35% lives very easily. That's, again, thousands of lives you're talking about, right? Similarly, if you are passionate about a subject, that's a great start. I think it's important to get granular to solvable, edible entities, right? What is it that you can actually chew on and solve? And when you start with that, then you build on that success. So we started with the Good Samaritan Law. We built on that success to get the Motor Vehicle Amendment Act of 2019 through, which had many, many more changes, which brought in new penalties, child safety, accountability for contractors, crash investigation, all sorts of things. We then built on that to run zero fatality corridors and zero fatality districts today. And today we have an MOU with the government of India to take that to 100 highways and 100 districts across the country. Now we are looking at codifying whatever works and make it into a code so that other people can follow it, right? So I think you have to pick up a small part of the problem, start solving that, and build on that success to take on more complex, bigger chunks
As you go.
of the issue that you're passionate about.
And it sounds like,
so I think that's really,
and like you do the homework, like you build the foundation, and then the more consistent you are, the more it compounds. Do you ever get depressed or low looking at the news, and what's your fix for that? Or social media. Doom scrolling is also a thing, obviously.
I mean, on my social media, if you scroll, you'll mostly find dog-related suggestions. So I think I've gamed the algorithm to some extent to only give me, a certain kind of posts. But it is definitely not pleasant. It does get depressing at times. I think our job at SaveLIFE is very, very hard. We have to confront trauma every day. I wake up looking at postmortem reports. I sometimes wake up with the most horrifying photographs anybody can ever see. And they're all part of our job, because as SaveLIFE, we now forensically investigate crashes around the country, across the country for the government of India and state governments. Recently, we've done some work for the Supreme Court. So it's part of the job, but we necessarily have to confront trauma every single day. So for us, it's very important it's easy, therefore, to keep slipping into the zone of, this is an unsolvable problem,
Mm.
or this is something that just doesn't seem to stop, or too many people are being killed in this. I think the solution to that is to talk to the victims. I think every time you talk to the victims, you realize how much more work there is for you to do. And for some people, it might be overwhelming, but for us, it's a great motivation that, okay, we still have work to do. We still have something laid out for us to do. It's also very important for us to take care of our mental health. So we regularly seek help. We have an open call for our employees that anytime they feel overwhelmed psychologically, we will find and pay for their counseling if needed. We have, for certain kinds of medical issues, we have unlimited leaves at Save Life, so you don't have to worry about any of that. We also encourage all of our employees to take more frequent breaks. So, and I take frequent breaks myself because I end up kind of becoming the funnel where all of that bad news goes through. So it does get overwhelming at times. So I do take as many breaks as I can. At night, you'll often see me just watching a comedy and not watching news, not doing anything else, just to unwind. It's almost a daily routine now, just to watch something light or read something light or talk to friends or spend time with family and not indulge in, sort of consuming more negativity that sort of surrounds us these days. So yeah, I think that's definitely, some of the things that we do. And it's easy to fall into that trap. And it's also important to be conscious of that and pull yourself out of it.
That's incredible. I was going to ask you about the mental health thing. I'm so glad that you have that, for yourself and for the team. As we wind this down, just a couple more questions for you. One is, we're hearing a lot about sort of this age of ascendant AI, right? I mean, Gen AI is everything. Everyone's talking about sort of age AI and stuff. How important do you think it is to be, examining first principles as leaders? Like, how important do you think empathy is as a leader? How do you view yourself as a leader? Who's a leader that, that you would emulate, or the leader you want to aspire to be? What are your thoughts on that?
So I do think that AI is a great enabler. I think it's something that's supporting us a lot. We're now looking at pulling all of our data in and doing some predictive analysis work. So can we predict crashes if certain conditions are met? And then can we reposition ambulances? Can we reposition police enforcement? So I think it has huge potential. So, great respect for folks who worked on it and who are continuing to make it smarter. You brought up a very important point of empathy. I think one of the things that I tell my PhDs who join Save Life is that be ready to unlearn. Because when you go out on the road, your thesis is going to be challenged every single day, whatever you have done, whatever you've studied. And the only way to work with that is not through defense, but by empathy. So I'll give you a small example. We, were dealing with an issue on a highway where there was a 10-kilometer slope and trucks would come down at neutral using their brakes to slow down. Brakes would heat up, not apply, and then they'll go and ram into people. And, mass casualty incidents would happen regularly. We tried many things, but locals there, a tribal person there told us that, you should illuminate this spot. That will help. And our engineering team said there is global guidance that illumination has nothing to do with safety. You just need to have strong reflectors, boards, and all of that. And, the deaths kept happening. So this person repeated a suggestion when I was in one of the meetings. And I insisted that my team at least test it out for a kilometer and see what happens. And when we tested it, we immediately realized that it worked.
Oh, wow.
And then we got the government to illuminate the entire 10:2 section of that highway. And we have eliminated those kind of fatalities from that highway. Now, if we had purely relied on scientific published reports or our prowess as engineers, we would have kept, sort of dealing with this issue. It's only when we empathized with the wisdom of the local person who was there that we were actually able to solve this problem. And we've now built that as a practice within Save Life that, we'll keep our degrees, our egos, our all of our, technical reports outside. And in every project, we will go and talk to the public to better understand the data that we have with us, to get a better sense of that. I think that's a very important part that we have realized ourselves and we continue to practice now as part of our core operations. But it is absolutely critical as a leader to be able to recognize when, to use, actually apply that knowledge that comes from empathy and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very critical learning for us. And I do believe that a good leader is one that definitely, wears empathy as the top core value over anything else.
So that's fantastic. I'm beginning to understand your brother's message now because I'm listening to you and I'm like, what am I doing in my life? I feel like most of our viewers and listeners hopefully will be as inspired. It's really inspiring to hear the work you've been doing, the impact you've been creating, and the fact that you're aware to, of all of these nuances, including the importance of empathy. We'll end on one note of gratitude, perhaps, Piyush, something you're grateful for today that you'd like to share.
I think family. I'm absolutely grateful for my family. They've been my biggest pillars of support. My parents, my siblings, our larger family, they've just been incredible support structure. I'm very, very, very grateful for that. I'm also grateful for the tribe that I've been able to build, my mentors, my board members, all of our donors. I think they not just support us with resources and knowledge. I think their support also is very clear indicator of how important this issue is. And I think that sort of, re-energizes me every day to keep working on it and trying to resolve this very, very tough issue. But I think basically that, I think I'm just very, very grateful for family, friends, and my larger tribe. Can't be, there isn't anything else I could have asked for.
That is incredible. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for this chat, and more power to you, your team, and your tribe for all that you do. We'll actually link to a few of the resources that we've discussed in your site and anything else you think viewers should take a look at. Thanks so much, Piyush. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Anita. Thanks a lot.